Welcome to Surviving Stories. In today's video, we're going to be covering the basics of dyslexia, how it affects people, and why understanding it is so important. So, let's get started with the big question. What is dyslexia? So, dyslexia is a learning difficulty that mainly affects reading and writing. People with dyslexia often struggle to connect the letters they see on the page with the sounds that they represent. This makes tasks like reading fluently, spelling correctly, and sometimes even writing more challenging. But here's the really important thing to know. Dyslexia isn't at all connected to intelligence. People with dyslexia are just as smart as everyone else. It's simply that their brains process information, especially language, in a different way. That difference can make reading and writing difficult. But it doesn't mean that a person with dyslexia can't be successful. In fact, many people with dyslexia are creative thinkers and they excel in areas outside of reading and writing. So you've got Richard Branson, who's a very accomplished businessman, Walt Disney, who was very creative in his art forms and creating animations, and so on. So, to put it simply, dyslexia affects how people process language, and it often shows up when someone is trying to read, write, or spell. But with the right support and strategies, people with dyslexia can overcome these challenges and thrive. So, let's talk about one of the main ways dyslexia shows up in reading. So dyslexia makes it harder for people to recognize the sounds that letters make, which is why reading can be so challenging. And what I mean by that is the letter A makes the A sound, B goes B, C goes K, and those are the sounds they make, and people with dyslexia can struggle with that. So for most people, reading involves quickly recognizing the letters, understanding the sounds they make, and putting them together to form words. But for those of us with dyslexia, that process doesn't happen as smoothly. It's like having to decode every word you see on the page. So whereas you may read duh, 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 those of us with dyslexia may end up reading duh, 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 because it's a slower process for us to decode those words. So people with dyslexia may struggle with decoding, which means breaking words down into their smaller parts and then sounding out those smaller parts. So cat, if we break it down, would be k-at. And then we build it back together, cat, cat. Because of this, reading tends to be much slower and requires more effort. So those of us with dyslexia might find that we get tired easily when we're reading, or we may have to reread sentences over and over again multiple times for us to fully understand them because we spend so much time decoding each individual word that we don't get the meaning the first time. We've then got to read it again. So when it comes to reading fluency, it can be hard to achieve that smooth automatic reading that people take for granted because dyslexic readers might have to pause quite frequently or stumble over words or have to work harder to keep track of where we are on the page. And I've definitely experienced this myself. Reading takes me a lot longer, and I often have to stop and think about what each word is, especially if it's a new or a tricky word that I haven't come across before. But it's important to remember that with practice and the right strategies, these challenges can be managed. So next, let's look at how dyslexia can affect writing. So writing is a skill that can be especially tricky for those of us with dyslexia, and there are a few ways that it can show up. First, there's the challenge with spelling. So people with dyslexia often struggle with spelling words correctly, even words that we use a lot. And it's common for us to spell the same word in different ways, even in the same piece of writing. Which is I don't know how or why but we do. And this happens because the brain has that difficulty connecting the sounds with the letters. So when we see a letter, when we're reading and we're trying to work out the sound, the same's in reverse. And that can make our spelling feel inconsistent. And some books and research articles describe it as bizarre. We have bizarre spelling. Another challenge is organizing thoughts and structuring our sentences. So dyslexic writers may have great ideas, but we can struggle to actually put them down on the paper because our verbal language tends to be stronger than our written language. So we can come up with brilliant ideas, amazing stories, but we can't write it down. And we can struggle with organizing our sentences, or we can struggle with structuring our paragraphs and the overall structure of an entire piece of work. It can be difficult, which leads to our writing that can feel quite disjointed and confusing and doesn't have a logical flow, which is a total mismatch to what we can actually talk about a subject. And writing can feel quite overwhelming and confusing, especially when someone is trying to think about how to spell the word and trying to get the grammar right and trying to get our ideas across. If you think about all the different individual skills that make up producing a bit of writing, that's a lot of skills that we're having to use. And then for someone with dyslexia who struggles with them all, trying to do them all at once, it doesn't work. So it's very challenging. So on top of that, people with dyslexia will struggle with grammar and punctuation. So we can find it difficult to apply the rules correctly. So things like, where do we place the comma? Now there are so many different ways to use a comma, and then trying to remember which one to go while we're trying to spell a word and make sure a sentence makes sense. It's a lot for our brains to try and process. Then you've got to think about tenses. When you're doing academic writing, kind of always have to write in the third person, but then what is the third person? And what's the second person? What's the passive person? What's the first person? And then you can end up with a big mix of all these different tenses going on. And it's just a very challenging process. So from my personal experience, writing can feel like a constant balancing act. Even when I have the ideas in my head, getting them out correctly and put down on a piece of paper takes a lot of effort. And there are a lot of strategies I use to support myself with writing and even checking that my writing is accurate, which I'll go through in a later video. But with practice and tools like spell check and assistive technology, these challenges can be managed. So, besides the difficulties with reading and writing, dyslexia can show up in a few other ways too. So one of these key areas that can be affected is phonological processing. So this is just the ability to break words down into their sounds. So those of us with dyslexia find this quite hard. We find it hard to recognize the sounds as well as to manipulate the sounds. And this can make it difficult to spell words and to understand how letters and words come together and what the relationship between the two is. So what I mean by manipulating sounds is if we take the word scar, and now I want you to remove that sound off the front, what word's left? Car. Or it can be swapping letters. So what would dog without the d be and an l instead? So dog would become log. It's things like that, manipulating them. Another sign of dyslexia is difficulty with short-term memory. So this means having trouble remembering instructions, sequences, or lists. For example, I might give you a set of instructions, but then you may forget one or two or all of the steps that I've asked you to do when you try to follow them. It could be things like you've got your shopping list, you forgot your shopping list at home, it's fine, I'm going to go into the shop and get everything off the list. I'm not going to get everything off the list because I've forgotten stuff. That can apply to more than just people with dyslexia, but I know in my personal experience, I keep forgetting to get rinse aid for my dishwasher. So for 4 weeks, I've been running the dishwasher without rinse aid because I keep forgetting. It's also common for people with dyslexia to mix up similar looking letters. For example, B and D can get confused, P and Q can get confused, P and 9, Q and 9, 5 and S. All these similar looking letters and numbers can be mixed up and with each other. And this can make reading and writing more challenging. And finally, people with dyslexia can struggle with following sequences. So whether it's following directions, if you ask someone for directions, how do I get to the library? Or you go left and then a right and then straight on and it's the third on the left. Good luck with that. And I experienced that recently. I was going to buy a new car and the place I was getting the car from, I think I stopped and asked 5 different people how to get to this place and I still got lost because I could not remember the directions on how to get to this place. So I remember facing some of these exact challenges in my life, and I still face them currently. I quite often am putting B instead of D and D instead of B in my writing and then having to fix it. I have trouble remembering directions. I forget things off my shopping list when I go to the shops. It's something that a lot of people with dyslexia do experience, but if we understand these signs, we can then help find the right strategies and supports to put in place for people. So there are quite a few myths and misconceptions when it comes to dyslexia, and I just want to clear some of these up. There are lots more, which I'm going to go through in a separate video, but I've just picked out 3 this time to go through. And the first myth is that dyslexia is related to intelligence. And it's simply not true. Dyslexia just affects how the brain processes language. It has nothing to do with intelligence. So people with dyslexia are just as smart as everyone else. They just learn and process information in a different way. Another myth is that people with dyslexia see letters backwards. And this was that BDPQ kind of myth that we see them backwards. And that's not true either. So dyslexia has nothing to do with vision. It's not a vision problem. It's about how we decode words and then connect those letters to those sounds. So while it is common for people with dyslexia to make letter reversals, not every person with dyslexia does that. It's just how our brain is processing those letters. And it's not because we see them incorrectly. And the final myth I want to go through today is that dyslexia only affects reading. That's not the case. Dyslexia impacts other areas like spelling and writing and even the short-term and working memory. It's more than just a reading issue. It's about how the brain processes language as a whole. So I think it's really important to dispel some of these myths, well, all of the myths and misconceptions about dyslexia, so people understand that what dyslexia really is. And once we break down these misconceptions, and there are a lot of other areas that dyslexia impacts that I will go through in more detail in another video, it helps us to create better understanding of the challenges that people with dyslexia face and how we can then in turn support them. So we're going to briefly look at how dyslexia is diagnosed. So dyslexia can't be diagnosed just by observing someone during reading and writing. It requires a formal assessment from a specialist. So the diagnosis process usually involves a specialist. It could be an educational psychologist. It could be someone like myself who's qualified to make diagnosis of dyslexia. It could be a speech and language therapist, but it has to be a professional. And what we look for is we assess a person's reading, we assess their writing and spelling, we assess their processing skills, and we also assess their memory. and then we look for how these are all interrelating and linking with each other. So we would look at their phonological awareness. So how do they approach decoding words? Can they manipulate the sounds in words? Can they, all these different skills that come under phonological awareness and phonological processing. And we also look at how well they understand language. So is their verbal language and vocabulary stronger than their actual reading and writing and spelling skills? And we do this and because if we know where the deficits are or the difficulties are, we can then provide the support. And the earlier that we can identify dyslexia, the better, because an early diagnosis helps make sure that the right supports are put in place and the right interventions in place earlier, whether this be in school, whether it's supports for the workplace, or whether it's supports and strategies for everyday life. But it's important to note that adults can be diagnosed with dyslexia too. It's not something that only affects children. Many adults find out later in life, and I've done some of these assessments where an adult has come to me and they've been diagnosed with dyslexia, and suddenly it all makes sense. That's why I was finding it so hard. That's why I didn't do particularly well at school. It's because I have dyslexia. And it's almost like you can see the weight has been lifted off their shoulders. There's a reason for it. So I was diagnosed with dyslexia when I was in primary school. I was quite fortunate. My parents knew that there was an issue. The school weren't recognizing it. So they took me to get an assessment and I was diagnosed. But some people don't get diagnosed until much later in life. It could be their workplace puts them forward for an assessment. It could be they put themselves forward for it privately because maybe the school has suggested that their child may have dyslexia and it's generally a hereditary condition, so it's passed on from parent to child. Oh, well, I find I have the same difficulty, so I'll get assessed myself and there are plenty of strategies and tools that we can put in place to help manage dyslexia. I was the same. My school put strategies in place and they put me on an intervention and my reading and writing and spelling and everything came on. But I think if I was identified and diagnosed earlier, would my difficulties be as much as they are now, or would I be more prepared? I don't know. But early identification and assessment, earlier intervention has a lot of benefits. So as we wrap up, I just want to leave you with a few key takeaways. First, it's important to remember that dyslexia is a lifelong condition. So it doesn't define a person. It can't define what they can or cannot do, or what they can and cannot achieve. With the right support and strategies, people with dyslexia can succeed in reading and writing and many other areas. And everyone's experience with dyslexia is different. Some people may struggle more with reading, others may struggle more with writing, and some may have difficulties with both. I've certainly worked with children that were absolutely brilliant readers, but it was their writing and spelling that they struggled with, and the reverse. So everyone with it is different. It's almost like it's on a spectrum. It's just important to understand that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to dyslexia, so it all has to be tailored specifically to each individual. And that's why early diagnosis and tailored strategies are so important. The earlier dyslexia is identified, the sooner someone can get the right support for them, whether that's in school, in work, or in their daily lives. And lastly, raising awareness about dyslexia helps break down those misconceptions. By understanding what dyslexia really is, we can create more supportive environments for people with dyslexia and reduce that stigma that's around it. So my own journey with dyslexia has taught me that it's not about fixing the challenges completely, because some of them will never be fixed, but it's about finding ways to work through them and the tools and the strategies that will help me to stop them being so much of a barrier. I hope this video has helped you better understand dyslexia. And if you or someone you know has dyslexia, know that there is always support available. There are plenty of charities and organizations worldwide that can support those of us with dyslexia. If you feel comfortable sharing your own thoughts and experiences about your dyslexia, feel free to put them in the comments down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.